Hello, everyone. Today I am joined by Dr. Swan Dow. Swan is an experienced designer, psychotherapist, and peace activist who's studied philosophy and theology at places like Melbourne, Oxford, and Chicago. They hold various certificates in community building and therapeutic practices. And this is what we'll be getting into mostly in this conversation, Swan is the founder and director of the Institute of Devotional Arts, which curates art and mindfulness experiences for inner and outer peace. And as we'll be getting into, there is an event coming up at Sky Meadow with the Institute. And so I thought this would be a wonderful opportunity to talk to Swan, talk about the Institute, talk about this event, and get a sense for that, so people know that this is coming up and to be excited about. So that's what we'll be exploring here briefly, and really excited for this. So, Swan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk about these things.
Thank you for inviting me, Brandon.
Yeah, this is great. So let's begin. Okay. So again, well, first of all, this is coming up at Sky Meadow Institute. This is happening, I believe it begins July 17th, goes through the 21st. And the devotional arts retreat, Imagination Now, is sort of the title for this. And this is very much in line with the sorts of things that I want Sky Meadow Institute to really be all about. And so I'm looking forward to hearing you talk about some of this stuff. But it's going to be, yeah, this really exciting event happening here. And well, let's just dive in. I mean, so talk a little bit about first, what is the Institute of Devotional Arts? And then we'll go a little bit into, yeah, your background and how you came to all this. But so set us up with that Institute of Devotional Arts.
What we do at the Institute of Devotional Arts is very simple. It's back to basics, really. We try our best to retrieve the place of art, the power of art within life and at the service of life. As you know, art, which serves the stage, the market, or the ego, art as a commodity, or even art for art's sake, is a recent Western concept. Art as a category that's separate from life. It's a recent Western idea. Art was always part and parcel of life. It was a vase, a beautiful vase, but it was used as a vase. It was an artifact that was part of the ceremony of the ritual. There was nothing that was made to be put on display, to be performed, to be placed on stage. And most of the arts today are placed up in locations where we go to watch art, to consume art. And oftentimes art is also seen as entertainment, whilst, as you know, it was never the case. Historically, arts served a much greater purpose. And I believe it was a twofold purpose. It was about bringing people together to honor that which is greater than us. Call that nature, divine, God. And so quite modestly, that's what we try to do. And we do that mainly through what, funnily enough, in English we call the performing arts. Though, as you understand, it's not about performance. In French, they call them the living arts, les arts vivants, which is much more appropriate. Spanish is the staged arts, which is not appropriate either. And that is to say, theatre, voice, song, and poetry. We also work with other art forms, visual arts. And the broader vision, when I say the arts, it's really about creativity, the creative spark, and the dimensions of existence that Western society, as you very well know, has been neglecting, if not denigrating, neglecting, pathologized. One of those dimensions is the body. And we're starting to realize that it's not all about our large brains. We're a very logocentric society. The body has its own wisdom, our emotions, our senses, beyond the five senses. But there's another dimension of perception, which I see as a way of perceiving, but also of relating and of being. That is the imaginal. As you know, the imaginal is this third category, which is neither purely intellectual nor purely sensorial. It's in between, the realm of imagination. And artists, but actually any creative individual, are the ones who are able to access that realm. Artists, scientists, entrepreneurs. And so it's about retrieving the power of the imaginal within life
Mm.
and the ontological value of the imaginal, something that is not mere entertainment. It's not of secondary concern. A lot of people think of the arts today as, it's something that we can appreciate. It elevates life. It enriches life. It ennobles life even. But yet, what gives us knowledge about reality is science. But even take a scientific example, we all know that Einstein and many other scientists did not reach their theories with mere equations. It took imagination.
Mm.
I like to cite the example, and I should look it up a little more because there's a culture that has a creation myth that involves two twin brothers, I believe, and they're said to be the brightest star in the galaxy. And I believe we know that Sirius, the brightest star that we can see, is actually two rotating stars,
Mm.
but that's not visible with the naked eye. So again, be it the theory of relativity, be it this creation myth, I believe that was understood, perceived through the imagination.
Mm.
To say a little more about our practices, mainly what we call performing arts, applied theatre, that is practices like playback theatre, theatre of the oppressed, physical theatre. But again, it's not meant to be. It's well, there is an element of performance.
Sure.
We do care about um, making it aesthetically pleasing, so to speak.
Mhm.
But there's an element of performance to anything in life,
Mm.
isn't there? So in a way, it's trying to reveal the play of creation, how everything we do, the way in which we socialize, the way in which we act, the way in which we speak, the way in which we stand, anything
Mhm.
is socially conditioned, and in a way is a performance. Don't need to read Shakespeare, understand that. Um, and so we draw attention to that. So it's also a space that's an opportunity for social deconstruction, trying to do things a little differently. And actually, if we break the fourth wall, meta theatre, when you draw attention to a play as a play, the fourth wall is life.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, so yeah, there's a lot in there. I'd love to unpack a little bit. So that's great. Um, so a couple things. I mean, the reason why a big aspect of this resonates so much with me and my own life, my own work is the kind of progression that I went through in relating to art and religion. Initially, as sort of like separate phenomena that I was passionate about both of these, but ultimately, kind of working through the kind of overly, I think, propositionally, maybe you say logocentrically dominated forms of religious belief and thought. Um, that itself kind of seemed to erode or break down, even as art, quote unquote, um, remained robust and something that actually kind of picked me up when a lot of the religious trappings that I've been engaged with early on seemed to fall apart. And then through that process, it came to be a very potent idea for me that it's actually through art, through the arts, through the what we call the aesthetic, that so much of religion has manifested and grown and evolved and been efficacious for people. And as you rightly point out, these terms, these categories have become sort of disconnected from one another. They've been sort of differentiated in a modern context when historically they were very much fused and very much working together. And so when I went on to get my master's in religion and the arts, it was precisely out of an interest in these issues. And for me, I studied at the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, which is really all about the nexus between art and spirituality, essentially. So one of the things that I'm really very passionate about is precisely the sort of work that you're engaged in and that this institute is engaged in, is trying to kind of connect these domains, and the aesthetic and the spiritual and the means of creativity, as sort of the uniting aspect there. And so so this is just a beautiful thing that you're doing, the work that you're doing. I'm very excited about. This event, as you say, engages myth, play, and poetry. Obviously, I'll put a link to this event and all that, and a link to the Institute so people are more familiar with this. But that's just a little bit of where I'm coming from and why I think that this work that you're doing in the Institute is such a wonderful synergistic thing with Sky Meadow. But say a little bit, if you would. I'd be really curious to know, how did you come into this field? These sets of ideas, and and not just, as you rightly point out, not just ideas, but the kind of embodied aspect to all this as well. I think when you were talking, embodied art seemed to be maybe a term that better encaptures, the performative aspect of this, because for all the reasons that a word like performance maybe is still kind of too much with that aesthetic category. But all of these are deeply embodied aspects. But yeah, just I'd love to hear some of your biography and how you came to this work and where the Institute comes from. You are the creator and the co or the director. So yeah, if you would talk a little bit about your story with all this.
Certainly, thank you. I'm happy to share a little more about personal journey, which is very much linked to the Institute, as you can imagine. So, as a good Westerner, even though I'm half Asian, I was also very much logocentric, brain-centered. I studied analytic philosophy. There can hardly be anything more intellectual than that, I don't think. Um, and believe it or not, philosophy led me to, well, philosophy of science and philosophy of religion, and then to theology and comparative religion. But if I backtrack a little, in terms of spirituality, I was expelled from my Catholic school
Hmm.
when I can't remember, 12 or so. So I was a little too inquisitive. And I think I was the only one at school that took those questions seriously.
Mm.
I think I'm the only one who went on to study theology. My chaplain at the time didn't really like my questions, so they kindly invited me to leave. Um, and so I was quite upset and anti-religious for a number of years. Um, and I think my worldview was more scientific. And it's through philosophy of science that I realized that actually science rests upon a large number of presuppositions about reality,
Mm.
um, and that theologians also had serious things to say. And to be honest, I was shocked basically to come across people that I held in high regard and I thought were very clever, and yet were religious because I thought it was nonsense. But,
Mm.
how could this be? This is Oxbridge John, who is also Christian. And so through philosophy of science and the philosophy of religion, I realized, yes, they have pretty good arguments, and it's much more complex than I thought. So
Mm.
I was able to move beyond this original naivete. But I still didn't understand why people went to church. Why did people pray? Um, just to say a little more about my spiritual background. So my parents are not particularly religious, but then I later on realized that my ancestors were. Um, and my great grandfather on my father's side, who's Vietnamese, was one of the pioneers of Chaldeism, or the Dao Cao Dao faith, which is a tradition from southern Vietnam. It's a syncretic tradition. And it turns out he was an artist,
Mm.
a devotional artist, you may say. So perhaps it's in the family.
Mm.
In any case, to go back on, so I was studying philosophy and trying to understand things from a very intellectual perspective. And at some point, I realized, yes, there are good arguments for this, but I didn't feel anything. I didn't understand why people prayed. And my friends who were religious encouraged me to go to church, to pray, to take part in ritual. And at some point, I yielded, and that's what I did. And that was a huge turning point for me,
Mm.
um, unsurprisingly. And I actually also realized I better understood a number of ideas, theories, or concepts through practice,
Mm.
which is now very obvious to me. Um, but so much so that at some point I completely moved away from the intellectual side of things.
Mm.
It was all about practice. So I was spending my life going from temple to temple, monastery to monastery, and I contemplating becoming a monk at some point, joining a religious order.
In what tradition? I'm just curious.
And it was in the Benedictine tradition,
Oh, fascinating.
mainly for Gregorian trance, to be honest.
Mm, mm,
But I was never quite ready to make solemn vows, to
mm,
become a monk for life. In a number of traditions, as you know, like in Theravada Buddhism, um, you can become a monastic for a number of years, 3 or 4 years, instead of taking a gap year before after university,
mm,
you join a religious order and then you go back to the life of the laity, which would have appealed to me at the time, but not in that tradition. And there was no option
mm,
in the Benedictine order.
mm,
So I didn't end up doing it, although I did spend a significant period of time in various monasteries. Um, but I didn't quite find the sense of community I was after, partly because there was no one my age. And so it was a very lonely path.
mm,
And I think the first time I felt some kind of what I would consider a spiritual connection to other people was through practices like nonviolent communication and a number of peace building gatherings that I participated in. And that was, I would say, my second turning point. So it was really about back to the body in community.
mm,
And in a way, though, the institute is called Devotional Arts, and you may think it's about this movement, elevation. I think it's more about this
mm,
coming together.
mm,
And and then we'll see if this happens.
mm,
Um, but I think a lot of people want to go straight to the stars. Some call that spiritual bypassing. A lot of people get lost, and there's lots to do on
mm,
this plane of existence as well.
mm,
And so I very much care about the social aspect of what we do as well as the spiritual aspect,
mm,
bring both together. And I've been in many spheres, social circles where those are distinct. People that identify spiritual that no longer care about so-called earthly concerns, and people who are deeply engaged in activism, social justice, and say they have no time for spirituality.
mm,
Maybe not so much in the United States, but that's been my experience in other parts of Europe. Um, so yeah, in a few words, that's my story. And then I study the artistic side of things. I ended up studying theology, but also at some point I was sick and tired of academia. And so I dropped out of my first PhD, which was on monasticism.
mm,
That was the closest I got to becoming a monastic. I thought, okay, I'll stay in academia, but I wrote my thesis
mm,
on monasticism. That way I'll spend as much time as possible in monasteries. And it turned, I ended up spending time in Catholic schools and not finding all that much,
mm,
which is not what I had planned. And so I had to abandon that project. And I went to drama school, which had been a dream of mine for a long time. And I found a great sense of community, but also I found a tremendous amount of what I would call spiritual depth.
mm,
Um, and I mentioned social deconstruction. As any actor knows, you need to know a lot about the human experience to
mm,
be a good actor. Um, and so I also studied physical theatre, which is quite different from, or specific, different from other acting styles. Um, again, to move away from something overly intellectual and really delve deep into the body.
mm,
Um, and I found that through practices like clowning, mask work, did quite a lot of mask work,
mm,
where it's unsurprising that actually you have to remove your social masks to then put on another mask. And as you know, in many traditions, masks are not just social creations, they're ways to embody deities,
mm,
like Balinese masks. So you don't don the masks, you enter the mask.
mm,
You don't put it on. It's not something you play with. Um, you play in a slightly different way.
mm,
Actually, I think the word for art and play in some languages from Africa is the same.
mm,
In any case, I'm digressing here. So the end of the story is then I also I studied various forms of psychotherapy, hypnotherapy. So I would say there's the intellectual side of the story, um, the partial disillusioned with that, the embodied and collective side, and the therapeutic side.
Hmm.
But the therapeutic side, maybe not so much in the way that most people mean today. I'm a fan of post-Jungian approaches, James Hillman.
Hmm.
It's really about the care of the soul,
Hmm.
which is what etymologically psychotherapy means,
Yeah.
rather than just healing a number of symptoms so that you can function well in society
Hmm.
and go back to business as usual.
Hmm.
Um, and also, I say we work with performing arts, but I mentioned the imaginal. And recently, I'd say that one of the things that interests me most is recovering the power of the image as something that is not to be grasped merely visually. We think
Hmm.
image, visual, see the image, end of
Hmm.
the story. And we think of imagination also as visualization, often. Whilst there's much more to imagination than just visualizing something, and there's much more that to the image than a mere visual representation.
Hmm.
And retrieving the power of the image and the function of the image. And the simplest example of that is architecture. Most pieces of architecture have a function. It's a building that's used as shelter, it's a place of worship, but it's rarely just a building that you contemplate, that you look at. And that was the same thing for sculptures or images. And so for most cultures, it would be preposterous to just have something displayed on a white wall in a museum
Hmm.
because that's not what it's for.
Hmm.
Uh, if not a sacrilege, I suppose, in some cultures. They would be shocked to see those objects, those pictures, those sculptures displayed. So I see it as they would see it, I think, as almost obscene and disrespectful.
Yeah.
I'm not saying there's no place for that. I'm not totally against museum and putting
Right,
artworks
right.
on
No,
display.
but no,
But
it's a very historically novel and unusual way of relating to images and so I mean, I'm getting the impression that all of these strands converge in the Institute and its sort of mission and the kind of work that, or the kind of play that it does, in the sense of bringing together the spiritual, the therapeutic, the embodied. Where, and when did this vision for this institute occur?
we've also been collaborating with a number of transpersonal psychologists. Um, and as you know, and as many of the listeners I'm sure know, transpersonal psychology is one of the fields, emerging fields, um, that seeks to be holistic in this way,
Mm.
integral. I mean, integral theory
Mhm.
was historically linked to transpersonal psychology, wasn't it? So one of the first events we organized was with Jorge Ferrer, who was the chair of the East-West department at the California Center for Integral Studies, um, birthplace, I believe, of transpersonal psychology, where Stanbrook and many others. I'm not sure Stanbrook was there, but so we have loose links to the world of transpersonal psychology. But you're right. I mean, the intention is to offer something holistic, integral, to build bridges,
Mm.
and that's what you're doing as well. I think we need more of that. We talk a lot about interdisciplinarity today, but I think there's rarely real interdisciplinarity. You
Mm.
have your discipline and you branch out a little and you talk a bit about something else.
Mm.
It stops there.
Mhm.
But I think um, historically there were no disciplines. I mean, I'm a philosopher, so I would say that originally everything was philosophy, right? uh, um, and disciplines are useful, but we're as you know, very special. We're specialists. Our society still doesn't value generalists very much,
Mhm.
and it's obviously very. You can't be a Renaissance person anymore because everything is so specialized.
Mm.
So I'd say it's needed more than ever to build these bridges.
Yeah.
Not to mention political polarization and any of that, but just in terms of knowledge of understanding
Mhm.
in different ways. And I think with the disciplines or like with any categories, hence the polarization, hence the conflict, is that we mistake the map and the territory. We we care so much about these categories that are supposed to make things easier for us. It's supposed to help us navigate life. It's supposed to bring clarity,
Mm.
but it does the opposite. you know, we care so much about, no, this is how it starts, this is how where it ends.
Mm,
Um, so using our categories, including art, for what they are, that is just signposts, or rather than, or like I think identity is the same thing.
mm,
Um, take gender as an example. I think gender fluidity, for example, should be trivially true.
mm,
Of course, it's fluid. Or when one talks about, I don't know, innovation and tradition. Well, it's trivially true. It's a basic sociological fact that things evolve, or biological, sociological, you name it.
mhm.
So certainly you'll innovate upon tradition, and there's nothing new under the sun. So there's no such thing as a radical innovation. Um, so what I mean is it's not just holistic. We want nuance. And I think you're bringing a lot of nuance with your metamodern spiritual work. And philosophy is about, I think, if anything, bringing and valuing the nuance.
Yeah. And a lot of integration, it seems, between, you know, you get this differentiation, and this isn't my point. I think Habermas makes this point, but it's also something that Ken Wilber picks up on in his integral philosophy, which is that with modernity, you get this differentiation that occurs, and that is where art breaks off from religion, and then you get, you know, the blank walled gallery, and you get,
Mm,
you know, and this sort of like these things separate. And that leads to a kind of sense of fragmentation, I think, within our own psyche, because we have these deep connections to these things, but now they're somehow severed from one another. There's kind of, you know, the good, the true, and the beautiful kind of break off into these different modern modalities that are now distinct, and that there's a need after that to try to bring those now independent strands back together, and to
mm,
find some kind of a way in which they can generatively interact and interweave and create some kind of surplus cohesion from those individual parts. And that is, again, also a big mission of the stuff happening at Sky Meadow Institute, is to do that sort of work, which is both embodied, but it's also conceptual. And so in many ways, yeah, I feel like that's a big part of that shared vision. There is the integrative mission to bring back together. I'm curious, in hearing your story and in hearing, you know, in hearing all of this, I guess, is there seems to be this enduring division uh, between body and mind, between the embodied and the conceptual, that we're still struggling with, I think, culturally, and we're struggling to make sense of how to do religion in that vein. I mean, you have a very impressive academic pedigree, and as you say, come from sort of the life of the mind, but then you enter this Benedictine monastery, and you are engaged in, as you say, like just like full on participatory, you know, kind of ritualized, embodied uh, activity. Um, for me, the question, and I think we're trying to grapple with this as a culture, is can we do both? How do we do both? Right. One of the big things that's happening in the broader conversation around this sort of Christian turn at the moment is that a lot of people rightly recognize, if you do participate and find community, and do the ritual, go through the liturgy, find the community, all of that, then what had seemed like dead religion suddenly springs to life, right? But then there's the hang up of what do we do with the propositional content of these religious traditions, right? Does that mean that because that's all working and vibing really well, that we have to then affirm, you know, an ancient cosmological vision of like 6 days creation and that sort of a thing? And I think a lot of people feel like the head part and the heart and embodied part somehow need to, it's sort of an either or, which again, to me, all this work seems to be gesturing towards that's a false dichotomy, that we need to be integrating these things together. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? Maybe even from your own life, of how you've been able to bring back the togetherness of sort of the conceptual and the propositional, as well as the participatory, and the perspectival, in a way that doesn't feel like there's an inherent tension there anymore. And is the role for that, let's say, creativity and art, is that somehow the mediating bridge?
mm. Thank you for this question. As a metamodernist, the answer may be, as in I'm not sure I identify as a metamodernist, but I like to think so. Maybe the answer is oscillations, isn't it, between the two rather than the integration. Um, but when you were formulating your question, um, I couldn't help thinking about well, my time in a number of monasteries that approached mind in very different ways. Um, so Dominicans, as you know, tend to be quite intellectual. Benedictines quite a lot too. Ora et labora is a motto, but you could add lexio, prayer, work, and reading or study. But there is oftentimes a place for study, and in some traditions, some orders, talking about Christian traditions, it is there is more time spent. There's greater value placed on those activities than the others. It depends on people's temperaments, sensitivities, and some traditions, as you know, as a whole, like the Zen tradition, perhaps, um, they less of an emphasis on the mind. If anything, we try, you know, what so what I'm looking for to to find a way of preventing one from thinking too much, hence the
Hmm.
koan and so on. And so I remember my time in some of those monasteries where I was spending 3 hours a day reading. And actually, that's another funny anecdote. The only monastery I escaped from, as it were, I was also invited to leave, like my Catholic school, was a Zen monastery in the Netherlands, because I was reading Nietzsche outside and I wasn't allowed to do that.
Nietzsche will
It
get you in
was
trouble anywhere,
sacrilege.
it seems. Yeah.
I also did want I wanted to meditate. It was really lovely, and I had to stay in a dojo to meditate, which makes sense. It was very strict. Um, and actually, I want to say one quick thing about what we offer in our retreats and in our events, or some of them. It's There's a place for spiritual rigor,
Mm.
discipline, if you want that, but it's not imposed upon you. Um, we're metamodern individuals. No, but we do care about individuals' needs, and we try our best to find a balance between the needs of the individual and those of the collective, the anarchist dream. Um, and so there's a place for serious spiritual practice. And the practices we offer are very accessible, very simple. And our hope is that anyone can come with their tradition and deepen the tradition,
Mm.
whatever it is. If they don't have a tradition, that's fine too. Um, our practices suffice. And there's a place for solemnity, but there's also the place to laugh and
Mm.
to have fun.
Hmm.
And I'd say it's rare to have
Yeah.
both in the same space. In our culture, we have a lot of music festivals, Burning Man style events, and it's a lot of enthusiasm, especially in the US, perhaps. And then, oh, there are now more brief rituals and things like that. But it's rare to have and experience many spaces where you can really have both.
Yeah.
I think they're both essential to life.
That's
And let's not forget, sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think that's wonderful because I think that I totally agree that that's very necessary. Again, that's kind of one of those differentiation aspects where you get the sort of ecstatic, festival environment as an opportunity, and then you also have sort of, yeah, the solemn, religious ritual as an opportunity. But again, we're in this sort of like either or space where our spiritual
Mm,
containers don't often allow for both of those things to coexist, and therefore you inevitably wind up sort of missing out on bringing the fullness of your humanity and your existence into your religious life. Um, and so that to me is one of those very necessary innovations, for lack of a better term, that the more creative approach to spirituality can offer is a way to again kind of reintegrate those the fullness of our being in all of that. And I always think, speaking of Nietzsche, of I could never believe in a God that couldn't dance, that sort of a thing, right? And it's the same sort of thing. You can never believe in a God that doesn't laugh, that doesn't also have the full richness of the experience of what I think reality itself is sort of imbued with. And so there's some need, I think, to find ways of relating to that. But anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Not at all. No, no. It reminds me of the the first title of my thesis, which was rejected, was I think it was an ethical. It was a subtitle, an ethical anatomy of the dancing dissenter. Um, I do want to address your question because I'm realizing
Sure.
I'm digressing. Um, but I will answer it and related to what I just said. Fun-loving activities, and you mentioned ecstatic, and can help think of ecstatic dance
Mm,
or new age practices, so to speak, and tantra. Actually, I think tantra is a good example
mm,
um, because you have classical tantra, as it's sometimes called, um, and neo tantra. And you could, I'm really caricaturing and simplifying here, but you could say, well, the former is more serious spiritual practice, and the latter is more fun-loving,
mm,
ecstatic bliss. Um, and it also relates to the mind-body dichotomy. Um, the former, you could say, I'm not saying the former is disembodied, on the contrary,
mhm,
uh, but the latter is very much embodied, if not anti-intellectual sometimes, or
mm,
that's not what they stress most. And so I have experienced with both classical forms of tantra and neo tantra. So classical tantra being a spiritual tradition, a religious tradition that was prominent between the 8th and 14th century in Asia, in many countries in South Asia. Um, Tibetan Buddhism is a version of classical tantra, and neo tantra I see as, or good neo tantra in my opinion, as working on developing emotional and relational intelligence
mm,
in all sorts of ways. It could be so intimacy in a broad sense. It could be a conversation. It could be conscious touch. It could be sexuality. I think it's a shame when people reduce it to so-called sacred sexuality.
mm,
And they make reference to classical tantra, but oftentimes with one, most people, most neo tantrikas don't really know much about classical tantra
mhm,
because most classical tantric texts are in Sanskrit and they're only available in manuscript form. So you'd have
mm,
to know Sanskrit and to have access to manuscripts.
mm,
So only a few scholars can do that, and a few scholars are able to popularize tantric philosophy, so to speak, like Christopher Wallace, Tantra Illuminated. But most of them are writing in a rather obscure academic
mhm,
jargon, publishing in journals, and it's inaccessible, so no one
yeah,
really reads them. And they really don't want to be associated at all to the New Age, Neo
yeah,
Tantra. So much so that they sometimes deny the place of sexual rights or
mm,
so-called sexual rights within Tantra because they really don't want to have anything to do
mm,
with Tantra, sacred sexuality.
mhm,
Um, and so it's a good example, I feel, of we're the serious intellectuals, and they're the crazy lunatics, hippies.
yeah,
And the hippies are like, well, we are all about the heart, the body, and they don't even mention much, but they don't even know much about the existence of those intellectuals, and they really not talk to each other.
mm.
Um, and I think it's a great shame. I think there's a place for both.
So one of the questions for me that comes up related to a lot of this, related to play, poetry, myth, the embodied, the conceptual, the need to bring together these differentiated aspects now of culture back together. Um, it seems like uh, the role of creativity um, and sort of aesthetic novelty could be to offer into culture new ways of relating to these phenomena that haven't existed before, but are able to do what is sort of required in this moment to help make those bridges occur. Right? If, for example, there isn't in the Christian tradition, let's say, a conception or an image or a symbol of the laughing God, of the dancing God, then maybe people need to make those images and those symbols.
Mm.
I actually, in my own work, called Gospel, in which I compiled a bunch of texts into a creative new work to serve as kind of a new form of gospel. Some of the work is totally original, and I'm writing it in ancient Greek as well. And I had to invent verses in which it said that Jesus laughed,
Hmm.
because if you read the New Testament, those words don't exist. And there seems to be then something missing from our relationship to the divine, to the sacred,
Hmm.
if we're lacking the fullness of that richness of existence in our sacred conceptions. And to me, then that sort of serves as an invitation to do this kind of work of creatively offering these developments to these existing traditions, but maybe also entirely new traditions. So, yeah, what do you make of that? How do you think of the role of creativity and art as being something that can carry traditions forward into novel domains and even generate new forms of religiosity entirely?
First, I'd like to comment on a word you used a couple of times, which is fullness, the fullness of our humanity.
Mm,
And I think it could be one simple, good definition of spirituality. The full human is the divine person. Um, and so again, making spirituality yet another category that's separate from life. Are you spiritual? To me, would makes no sense, or it is not necessary. I mean, you can some in some contexts it can make sense. You can specify it. Do you take part in these rituals? Do you hold a number of beliefs and so on and so forth? Um, but what I would want is for spirituality and art, as it's always been, as they've always been, to be part and parcel of life. Which is why in many cultures they have no category called religion, spirituality, art. No, well, of course there's a rite of passage, so we sing, and this happens. We pray, just like of course we eat, of course of course we give thanks, and also because it responds to fundamental human needs. And before we mention art, sometimes when I talk about the institute, I only talk about art, and people are like, "Well, what about the spiritual side of things?" And here, I don't know, because it's your channel, I feel like we talked a little more about perhaps the spiritual side of things, and I'm
mm,
neglecting the arts. But before we get to that, I want to say a few words about devotion, because I mentioned those fundamental needs, things that are just normal. We make mysticism something mystical. And the word mystical sounds like it's mysterious, it's out of the ordinary, it's taboo, it's and so on and so forth. But in most cultures, you talk about ghosts, you talk about visions, it's normal. So I advocate a normalization of all of those experiences. I think you and I mentioned that I wanted to write something called Against Wonder, and we mentioned that wonder is part of the original surprise, or one type of wonder at least, when one discovers something. But when it becomes natural, when it's second nature, when it's habitual, you can still appreciate it. You can still marvel at it. There can still be awe. It's a different kind of wonder. And I would want less of the ah, it's new. It's this. We're very much attached to novelty. What's the next spiritual
mm,
experience? I don't want spirituality to be a spiritual experience. That's what I mean.
mm.
And we are uh, you know hedonist, pleasure seeking, intense experience seeking, burning man. You know, I checked the box. You get it. And I would. That's one of the things I admired about the monastic life. It's the rhythm, the how everything, the slowness, the there's so much beauty in that. Um, the effort as well. um, and so fundamental human needs and devotion. Similarly, maybe less so in North America, but in Europe, words like worship, um, devotion, praise, outside of a religious context, are never used, and so never experienced, never enacted, never shared, perhaps never felt, or at least not made explicit. And I think that's the word sad, quite simply.
Uh-huh.
And a source of shame for some people,
Mm.
especially those who are the spiritual, not religious, those who, and I remember myself, um, I had deep spiritual experiences as a child that were also very much linked to an aesthetic experience. So the aesthetic and the spiritual for me were always intertwined.
Hmm.
And I just couldn't share that with anyone.
Mm.
And that contributed to my loneliness. And I'm sure many of your listeners have experienced that or experienced that. Um, and I've lived in the United States, and I studied religion there in settings. So then I went to a lot of religious communities. Obviously, that's normal, but I think one cannot underestimate how secular many parts of Europe are. And
Mm.
I grew up partly in France, which is one of the most secular countries in Europe. Um, and so offering a space where one can express one's devotion, which to me is very much linked to thanksgiving, to gratitude. Sometimes I simplify it as gratitude in action, because doing something about it is very important and not just feeling it.
Mm.
So it's linked to service. So the bhakti path and the karma path to me are very much linked. In the Bhagavad Gita, there are those four religious paths, jnana yoga, um, raja yoga, bhakti yoga, and there's no place for bhakti in a lot of places in the West outside
Mm.
of organized religion. And the difference here is, so we have the interfaith and the interspiritual, interreligious level being, we talk about our religious customs, or religious elites talk about their beliefs,
Mm.
and then the interspiritual level, the question is on the more practical side of things. How do you pray? What do you experience? How do you feel? And on that level, people can embrace more than one tradition. I sometimes compare it to polyamory. It's difficult to have 10 serious relationships if you
Mm.
want to deeply be in a deep
Mm.
relationship. Similarly, if you embrace a tradition, I think maybe two, three, four perhaps, but usually maybe a couple. Um, but I suppose we're offering another space in which all of that is possible, but it's also an open space for an open space and a creative spiritual space. And I know you also use the term creative spirituality,
Mm.
one that welcomes anyone with or without a tradition. And obviously, there is no intention to convert anyone to anything. And this may sound a little controversial, but I think all traditions are complete and can get you to wherever you need to get to, if there's anywhere one needs to get to. Some have refined or have a better understanding of some aspects of existence, so it's not all relative. I still think some have a better grasp of how the mind works and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And none are needed.
Hmm.
And I think it's the same with the arts. And if you'll allow me to be a little spiritual for a second, so to speak, I think it's the same for life, creation. Um, why is there something rather than nothing? I don't think it's needed, but I think there's beauty in it. In a way, we are ornamentation. It's so the approach is a little Zen, I would say, but funnily enough, I think the Zen tradition is illustrative of this because on the one hand, they say you don't need anything, emptiness, shunyata, and on the other hand, there is so much, right? Everything is so precise. You know, how you hold a stick of wood to hit it, um, and so on and so forth. There's so much precision, care, attention to detail, beauty, and art in the Zen tradition. Everything is visualized,
Mm.
maybe too much. They need to break the fourth wall at some point. Um, but they also, I think, deep down know that it's not necessary. Now we can talk about what it means for something to be necessary, but I don't want to go into that. On one level, I think you can do without it, but I think it's good that we have it.
What you just communicated landed for me as this very open expanse in which many other things can fit and of different sizes. And some things, some very small things, some very narrow things can fit in there, but also some very big things. And I'm using that as sort of a metaphor here for the different modes or ways that people can relate to their traditions, their religion, their spirituality, as sort of there's a kind of spectrum of its expansiveness. And for some people, the ritual, the sacrament, the theology, the doctrine, the dogma is very important. And that can all exist in that kind of expansive space you described. That frame can hold that, but that little tiny frame, I think, would have a big difficulty trying to relate to that bigger frame that it is nested in. It's almost like that bigger frame you described can hold the one, but the one can't hold the bigger frame. And when you mentioned like that they're all these traditions are complete, but they're not necessarily relative, radically relative, and they're also unnecessary. That's always one of these things that I am really trying to find the most optimal way to relate to the relativity of things, because I want to move towards that expansiveness that can hold all those things, but it also seems like that expansiveness is itself not relative. It's not the narrow thing. And to make it all very concrete, because maybe that sounded very abstract, um, a lot of my concern, including with my own biography, with where I come from, has been the having to navigate modes of religiosity that are very narrow and dogmatic and sort of uh, prescribed in a way that says no to a lot of existence, right? It says no to a lot of those things we were talking about, to that fullness, really. And it wants to say that this is just one thing and most things are wrong. Those modes of religiosity, I think people rightly take issue with, right? That there's something about the way that religion can be deployed that can also be harmful and weaponized. And and so one of the most difficult things for me to grasp is how to relate to the whole spectrum of how people themselves relate to their religion and spirituality, that can do justice to wherever people are at, um, but that doesn't necessarily then lead to this sort of radical relativistic stance that says, let's say that, the religious zealot who wants to martyr themselves and murder others is of a
Mm.
kin with a Zen monk, right? There's something there. How do you navigate some of those issues?
I think you're right when you say, that's what you say, forgive, correct me if misinterpreting you. But we need to be able to have spaces where we're aware that people have different backgrounds and different needs, and spaces that are flexible enough, adaptable enough, adjustable enough to bring people together who are, in a non-hierarchical sense, different levels on the path of life. I think that's desperately needed. And we don't have anything like the church. I mean, again, I'm coming from a Western secularist, European secularist
Mhm.
context. People don't go to church on Sunday. Um, and forgive me if I'm being overly simplistic here, but I think the simplest analogy is language. All languages are complete insofar as they serve the purpose for which they were created. We use them to communicate. That's more to say about language, but yeah, we know that we have different languages.
Mhm.
We know some languages are able to describe certain things better than others. I
Mhm.
won't rather avoid the Innu example of 1,000 words for snow, but yeah.
Mhm.
Um, so mutatis mutandis, I do think the simplest analogy for me, I see spiritual traditions as languages,
Mhm.
nothing more. Um, and I think the analogy stands to the extent that we also don't need language.
Mhm.
Silence is enough.
Mhm.
But it's good to have language. You can still do lots of things with it, and it's very beautiful. We can write poetry.
Mhm.
So similarly, just like traditions are complete, languages serve the purpose for which they're made, offered, given. Um, and yet people like Meher, many others, hermits, chosen silence. And I do think to some extent that they don't need to speak. Um,
Hmm.
Actually, we need to speak less. I know it doesn't resolve the social problem you presented, but I think it touches upon it on some level. What do you think about what I just shared?
No, I think that is there's a lot that captures very well. And um I mean these are very we're starting to get into, some very mysterious territory, or let's say some very big questions, right? And how we relate, the silence and the apophatic stance, right, to the and the emptiness, you could say, to also the fullness, and also the poetry, and also the kind of uh emanating effulgence of reality. These are like these, you know, in some senses polarities, and in some senses maybe false binaries, and maybe there's, ultimately a kind of deeper non-dual appreciation that is somehow captured in both of them. All these sorts of things come up for me exploring this. But but I'm maybe the one aspect that I would language slightly differently, or I'm intrigued to explore the possibility of, not that all traditions are complete, but actually I lean more into their remaining open, right? And I think that that's partly what excites me about the creativity aspect, and the play and the poetry, and the creative spirituality, is how it can continue to expand these traditions. Though I also recognize that you're using that term, I think, in a to capture something different about what you mean by that. So again, the limits of language here, right?
Mm.
But no, I think all of that very much resonates, and I think that that container that you're explaining and describing is a very beautiful one. And so to try to bring this back into, this event and the institute, and things that will be happening at Sky Meadow, maybe we can finish this conversation talking a little bit about what that'll look like. I think people hopefully will have a, very good sense now of the space that you're coming from, and that the institute's coming from. And
But
so
perhaps not. Perhaps it's become even more elusive.
well, then
But
good. Then they
I
can they
hope
can
it'll
come and
pique people's
explore.
curiosity.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So just for the next couple of minutes before we close this up, yeah, talk a little bit about what this specific event will
Mm.
be doing, devotional arts retreat. Yeah.
Mm. So I realized I haven't properly addressed your question about art. So I simply want to say that if there's to be a three-step process, I mentioned those movements.
Mm,
I think those would be the first one is we're bringing people together,
mm,
and we care a lot about them. So I mentioned our artistic practices, but we also work with a number of peace building and community building practices. I mentioned my personal experience with NVC, nonviolent communication, authentic relating, circling, tech forum. There are many others. So really be together in a social, but also in an imaginal way,
mm.
in an imaginative way, in a creative way, in a slightly performative way. But the being together, we care a lot about. And then the bringing things back to the body and back down to the earth. It's devotional arts, but if you look at our website, there's a lot of photos of nature.
Mm.
And I said, I personally want to find divinity through humanity, the sky through the earth. I want to go down to go. Um, so that would be the second movement. And then maybe the third bit. Who knows? Um, so I want to emphasize our peace building practices and contemplative practices, artistic ones, simple ones. Um, we work with polyphonic songs, sacred and folk songs. There are moments of silence. Everything remains an invitation. Um, we'll be joined by a number of guest artists. Kayeth Heller is a poet and religious scholar at Harvard. Um, Aaron, who is a philosopher and performer, but unfortunately he might not be able to make it.
Mm,
See, maybe next time. And we're still looking actually to invite a musician.
mm,
We like to have at least one. Sometimes people bring their instruments and contribute musically, but it's always nice to have a musician. I particularly enjoy string instruments, so if there's a cello player listening, they would be more than welcome.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
The theme, I would say just a couple of words about the theme: myth, play, poetry. It's important for us to use the right tools to address the right questions.
Mm,
And I think there is a place and there is value in analyzing a poem, for example. You may gain something from that, but I think you can also lose something. And there's something you can't fully get the poem if you're just analyzing it. Same with the image.
mm-hmm.
So we really want to grasp things for what they are and to use them, so to speak, in the right way. And beyond what we offer, it goes without saying that it's the people that are present, their presence, their knowledge, their energy, whatever you call it. That also makes up the event.
Mm,
Though we guide most of it, it's not fully co-created. There are moments we can offer certain things. It's mainly guided. Um, what people take away a lot of the time is the connections they make.
mm,
And we also encourage artistic collaborations, as there have been a number of collaborations that have emerged as a result of our gatherings.
mm,
Uh, Someone who works with Georgian polyphony, who is now collaborating with someone who works with Indian ink, for example. The Bhutto, Christian Bhutto dancer I mentioned, who is collaborating with another dancer who promotes something that she calls transcendental embodiment dance. Okay. Anyway, so we also very much encourage
mm,
those artistic collaborations. And we very much appreciate when there's a diversity of people from different backgrounds. A lot of our artists are also scholars or also therapists. Um, and a lot of our participants also at least have an interest in many of those different fields. So if you also have a multiplicity of interests in the themes we mentioned today, then you're more than welcome to join our
yeah.
retreat.
Now, if someone is thinking, but I'm not an artist, so maybe I can't come to this. It's not the right place for me. What would you say? I mean, is it this is uh need only artist
Yeah.
supplies, so to speak?
So that I do want to end by saying it's something I'm very sad, remorseful about, and that is, I think the way in which we see art today, this category that's separate from life, with
Hmm.
also professional artists and lay people,
Yeah.
um, is a tragedy because it alienates people,
Hmm.
and then they identify as non-artists.
Yeah.
So I can't sing, I can't dance, I can't, and so on and so forth. Whilst in all cultures, people sing, dance, it's just the most natural thing to do.
Hmm.
And I think our present state of alienation, for lack of a better term, is partly due to the fact that we can't express those basic things, just like devotion.
Mm,
We need to dance, we need to sing. That's how we respond to life. Those are languages. We need to
mm,
speak. Though I said silence is enough. True. Or, but on another level, they're basic needs. And so I think art as we see it today alienates both the artist and the consumer of art, so to
mhm,
speak. The latter for the reason I just pointed out. The former, less obvious, because sometimes in our society that is hyper specialized, if they want to be a good professional artist and sell their work, they can only do one thing.
mm,
It's particularly obvious when it comes to dance, say ballet. I've got a lot of friends who are dancers. You destroy your body
mm,
um, because you because you do that all day long, and also you may neglect other capacities as you the athlete example is the simplest example, so that you can run a second faster than the other chap, you ruin your health and you don't have time to read books or do anything else in life.
Mm.
Why? That's just whilst performance, um, elite performance, um, showing how what the human body is capable of, producing something that's more beautiful than the other artists. So that was never the case historically.
Mm-hmm.
The aim, the function of art was this. It's like, it was great. We had a good time. We were together. The gods were happy. We're happy. Was there, it was not about, did you sing the perfect pitch? The perfect pitch is we were happy. And sorry, beyond happiness, God was, and now it's like, oh, I'm an art critic. This
Yeah.
wasn't perfect, or I'm self-critic. I wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
So when I said, our intention is this, it's also like we try to be less individualistic. Just like we don't have a place for devotion. A lot of people can't, don't find means of artistic expression in all ways. We also hyper individualistic, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's not about the artist.
Yeah.
As you know, historically, most artists didn't sign their work.
Mm-hmm.
They had no social status um, until the 16th century. Even visual art was only about Christian worship. So it's not about the artist. So
Yeah.
anyone's welcome. Anyone's more than welcome. And I don't want to say we're all artists, but art is life, and art is for all of us.
Mm.
And we can not we don't benefit from it. We serve it,
Mm.
and we serve each other through it.
Mm.
And that's the most important thing. And it's one of the things I start reminding people. I do call these things just mere reminders. Let's serve each other. And our motto is remember that which inspires you, me. But remember that, serve that, whatever name you give it. And don't forget people around you, because and serve that through the people around you.
Yeah.
Basic spiritual teaching of any tradition, I believe.
Mm. Amen. Thank you for that. That was, yeah, precisely. Well, even much more eloquently and beautifully expressed than I'd even expected. But the sentiment was what I was hoping you would get to. I know, unfortunately, a lot of the way that people will grapple with that issue. Oh, I love art, but I'm not an artist, and there's that critique that you mentioned, and there's this again, that fragmentation and the differentiation, and so I'm
So quite clearly, we have people from all sorts of background who come.
yeah,
Uh, Professional artists, people who are just starting to grow again, just people who have never sung, and we appreciate and encourage that diversity.
yeah. Yeah, the art of life and the well, life is art in that sense, and I appreciate the event that the institute will be putting on as a opportunity for people to really live into that, sink into that, and experience it. So, wonderful. Well, this has been really illuminating for me as well. I'm excited for this particular event and looking forward to participating in it. I'm excited to see you and who for the folks who show up and to yeah, explore that together with other people is an exciting opportunity, and I'm
And
really honored to have this be happening here at Sky Meadow.
well, thank you ever so much for hosting us, Brandon. I do hope it'll be the start of a long-term collaboration between Sky Meadow and Ida. And let's not forget that you also be guiding a session. So if people want also to meet you and to work with you, that's also an opportunity to do that.
For sure, yeah. And where how would be the best way for people if they're interested in this, if they're hearing this, or like, wow, they want to know more, where would you direct them?
So we have a website and they can sign up to our newsletter. And we have an Instagram page. Both the website is devotionalarts.org. You'll add that to the description probably. And the Instagram is Institute of Devotional Arts.
Lovely.
Those are the best ways to reach out.
Fantastic. And I'll be talking more about
And of
this
course,
as
prayer. Prayer is always a good means of communication.
indeed. I'll be talking more about this too as we get closer to the date. And again, this is happening in July. But yes, as you say, hopefully just the beginning of a wonderful partnership between these two institutes with overlapping visions and goals and values, and really looking forward to it. But Swan, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time. I've really
Mm.
appreciated it.
Thank you ever so much, Brandon.